Hey guys, I'm Tax, here to go over the general knowledge you'll need to know for damage farming. So first things first, I want to thank the amazing testing team from AWTD for the help on some of the topics I'll be going over. And yes, this is a video going over the mistakes I made on my previous guide, so as of posting this, that video should be unlisted, but if you want to see the team formats and unit placements, on your top right, there is a card leading to that guide, since I won't be covering those topics. Or, alternatively, you can go to either my Discord or the official AWTD Discord, linked in the pinned comment, for updated team formats and notes. But, moving on, starting off with how damage amplification and slows work in AWTD. So starting off with one of the most important concepts to know is how values overwrite each other in this game. So starting off with a good example being the spare and vulnerable, which I'll show both of the descriptions for both passives, but I'll also explain them. So if you apply the spare onto an enemy, they would have a 30% base damage amp and a 50% slow. Now couple with that, when vulnerable is applied, which has a base 50% damage amp and a 20% slow buff, when both of these debuffs are applied, the vulnerable damage amp, which is 50%, will overwrite the 30% from the spare, but the spare retains its 50% slow, with it being buffed by vulnerable slow buff up to 70%. So in a nutshell, it's just higher values overriding the lesser value if it's a base debuff. The same concept also applies to slows, with the only two base slows being normal slow and the spare slow. You can also say that Pochita's passive slow is also one, but that's only 10%, which really doesn't matter. So if you apply normal slow onto an enemy and spare gets applied, the normal slow, which is a permanent 30%, will get overrun by the spare slow, which is 50%. And that's mainly it for the overriding part of this section. Now moving on to damage amps. So currently there are only two mainstream damage amp buffs currently in the game as of recording, being sleep and drowning, each respectively buffing damage amps by 20% each, which can both stack with each other. So if we put one damage amp buff onto both the spare and vulnerable separately, these would be the numbers you would be getting. For the spare, you'll be getting a 50% damage amp onto an enemy if you have one damage amp buff applied, while for vulnerable, it will be 80%. So for the damage amp buffs, when it's applied, it's an exponential, while for slow amps, it's an additive value, which was a mistake that I made during my last guide, which had them both, or for me, I assumed for both being additive. But moving on, here's both of the base damage amps being buffed by both of the current mainstream damage amp buffs in the game. So for the spare, it'll go all the way up to a max of 87.2%, while for vulnerable, it's 116%. Now, as I mentioned before, for slow amps that are additive, for the only slows in the game being the spare and normal slow, but you can only have one slow amp being applied at a time. So if we have all the slow amps, which include drowning, cosmic gravity, and vulnerable, onto normal and the spare slow, if you have them all applied onto an enemy with normal slow or the spare slow, you'll be gaining a max of either 50% or 70%, since you can only have one slow amp applied at a time. And moving on to our last topic, which is... So this section is just some other things to know for damage farming. So starting off with stuns, as you may know, there are a multitude of different types of stuns, ranging from normal stun to freeze. So how these work is that only one type of stun can be applied at a time. So for example, you can't have charm and paralysis being applied at the same time. Same goes with passes with a stun as a component to them, like sleep and rising voltage. But the only exception to this rule is the time stop debuff, where it can be applied on top of any stun. So there are two separate types of time stops, even though they're labeled the same thing, they are different. So these are range time stop and map wide. So with map wide time stop, it can only be applied once to an enemy, while with a range time stop, you have to wait for the debuff to actually disappear to apply another instance. So an example of this would be Dio Plus and Shanks Plus, where they have a manual that applies the time stop debuff for 9 seconds. So you have to wait until the debuff actually disappears to apply another instance of time stop from their manuals. So the timing for this to perfectly cycle this would be when the manual timer hits 30 seconds. And onto rewinds. So same principle as time stops, being separate debuffs but being labeled as the same thing. But for range rewinds, it's the same as a map wide time stop where it can only be applied once to an enemy, and same goes for map wide. However, there is one special thing that rewinds have that time stops don't, which is a third way to apply the debuff, which is Perumi, which has access to an arsenal of manuals, but the one that's really important is Yud, which is her rewind. So similar to a map wide rewind, but it's its own separate thing since it can stack with it. So you can have 3 different instances of rewind, being map wide, in range, and Kurumis. And that pretty much concludes the guide for damage farming on AWTD. So hopefully you enjoyed, that it was enough for you to like, subscribe, and comment. But if you wanted the most updated information, do go to the pinned comment and join either my Discord or the official AWTD Discord. And that's it for me. Peace.